When the spring thaw came in 1874, searchers expected to find the bodies of the Turner boys somewhere near the lake that had frozen solid during the previous winter. But the ice gave up nothing. No bodies beneath its surface. No evidence along its shores. No trace of the three brothers who had been ice fishing on the afternoon of January 12th and who had never returned home. The lake had frozen to a depth of nearly 3 feet that winter, creating ice solid enough to support the weight of men and horses during the search. But when that ice melted in March, it revealed only the empty lake bed it had always covered, as if the boys had simply ceased to exist the moment the water around them had frozen completely, leaving no remains and no explanation for where 3 children could go when surrounded by a solid sheet of ice that extended from shore to shore across a lake too small to allow them to become truly lost. Welcome to this journey through one of the most complete disappearances ever documented in the Ozark region. In the years when frozen lakes were common winter landscapes, and when ice fishing was both recreation and necessity for families who needed protein through cold months, when children understood ice and knew its dangers and knew how to recognize safe ice from dangerous ice, when the mechanics of freezing water were simple physics that left no room for mystery about where bodies should be found. If death occurred, there lived 3 boys who vanished from a frozen lake in broad daylight under conditions that should have made their disappearance impossible, who left behind fishing equipment and footprints, but no bodies and no evidence of where they might have gone, and whose absence has persisted for more than a century, with no resolution and no satisfactory explanation for how 3 children could disappear from the center of a frozen lake that was barely 2 acres in size. Comment where you're watching from as we trace the boundary between disappearance that can be explained and disappearance that resists all explanation. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we walk onto that frozen lake and try to understand how 3 boys could vanish from its surface without trace, consider what frozen lakes meant on the frontier, and why disappearances from ice were understood to be tragic but not mysterious. Bodies went into water beneath broken ice. Bodies remained in that water, and bodies surfaced when ice melted or were recovered when ice was cut and searched. The physics were simple and reliable. People who died on frozen lakes either fell through weak ice and drowned beneath the surface, or died from exposure on solid ice and remained visible on the surface until recovered. There was no mechanism by which bodies could disappear entirely, no way for ice to conceal remains so completely that spring thaw would reveal nothing, no explanation for how someone could be present on ice one moment and absent the next, without the ice showing signs of breaking, or without witnesses observing what had happened. The Turner boys, Robert age 14, William age 11, and James age 8, were the sons of Samuel and Margaret Turner, who farmed land approximately 5 miles east of what would eventually become Mountain View, Missouri. The boys were experienced in winter outdoor activities, had fished through ice many times during previous winters, and were considered by their parents and by neighbors to be responsible children who understood the risks of frozen water and who could be trusted to recognize dangerous conditions and to avoid them. They were not reckless, were not prone to taking unnecessary risks, and had never given their parents cause to worry that they would put themselves in situations where their safety would be compromised. The lake where the boys disappeared was a small body of water, perhaps 2 acres in surface area, oval in shape, fed by springs and by runoff from surrounding hills, that sat in a shallow basin approximately half a mile from the Turner homestead. The lake was well known to the family and to neighbors, was used for fishing during warmer months and for ice fishing during winter, when the surface froze solid enough to support people safely. The lake's small size meant that anyone on its surface was visible from any point on its shore, that becoming lost or disoriented was impossible, because the shore was never more than perhaps 200 feet distant in any direction, and that any emergency or crisis would be immediately obvious to anyone watching from land. The winter of 1873-1874 had been severe, with temperatures dropping well below freezing in December and remaining consistently cold through January. The lake had frozen early and had frozen deeply. By early January, the ice was estimated to be nearly 3 feet thick, solid and safe for any winter activity, showing none of the signs of weakness or instability that would indicate danger. The Turner boys had been on the ice several times already that winter, had caught fish through holes they had cut, and had shown the competence and the caution that experienced ice fishermen demonstrated. On the afternoon of January 12, 1874, the three boys left their cabin around 1 o'clock with their father's permission, carrying ice fishing equipment and planning to spend several hours on the lake before returning home before dark. The weather was cold, but clear. Visibility was good, and there was no indication of approaching storm or of conditions that would make ice fishing inadvisable. Samuel Turner watched his sons walk toward the lake, saw them reach its shore and walk out onto the ice, saw them begin to set up their fishing equipment in an area near the lake's center, where they had fished successfully during previous outings. Samuel returned to work on the homestead, expecting the boys to return by late afternoon, as they always did, planning to have them help with evening chores and then settle in for the night. But late afternoon came, and the boys did not return. Samuel was not immediately concerned. Boys sometimes lost track of time when fishing was good, sometimes stayed out later than planned because they were enjoying the activity or because they wanted to bring home additional fish. But as darkness approached and the boys still had not returned, Samuel's concern grew into alarm, and he walked to the lake to call them home. He reached the lake shore just as the last daylight was fading, and he called out to the boys, expecting to see them gathering their equipment and preparing to leave. But the lake was silent. Samuel could see the dark shapes of the fishing holes the boys had cut, could see what appeared to be some of their equipment still on the ice, but he could not see the boys themselves. He called again, more loudly, and when no response came, he ventured onto the ice, walking carefully despite its known solidity, moving toward the area where he had seen the boys set up their fishing positions earlier in the afternoon. He found their equipment, the ice auger they had used to cut holes, the fishing lines they had set, the small bucket they had brought to hold caught fish. The equipment was arranged as if the boys had simply stepped away briefly, as if they intended to return at any moment to resume their activity. But the boys were not there. Samuel walked the entire surface of the lake, calling their names, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. The ice was solid everywhere, showed no cracks or breaks that would indicate anyone had fallen through, bore the marks of the boys' footprints in the light snow that covered its surface, but showed no footprints leading away from the fishing area toward shore. Samuel searched the shoreline, thinking perhaps the boys had left the ice and had wandered into the woods surrounding the lake, perhaps chasing after something or exploring, but he found no tracks leaving the lake, found no evidence that the boys had returned to land after walking onto the ice earlier that afternoon. As darkness became complete, and as the temperature dropped into the dangerous range where exposure would threaten anyone still outside, Samuel had to return home to get help and to organize a proper search that would begin at first light. The search began the morning of January 13th, with Samuel Turner and more than a dozen neighbors systematically examining every inch of the lake's surface and its surrounding shores. The searchers found exactly what Samuel had found the previous evening: the boys' fishing equipment in place, their footprints visible in the snow covering the ice, but no sign of the boys themselves and no indication of what had happened to them. The ice was examined carefully for any sign of breaking or weakness. The entire surface was solid, showed no cracks or holes beyond the fishing holes the boys had deliberately cut, demonstrated no evidence that anyone had fallen through. The fishing holes themselves were examined. They were small, perhaps 6 inches in diameter, cut through 3 feet of ice, and it was physically impossible for a child to fall through such small openings. Even if a child had somehow gone into the water through one of these holes, the body would not have been able to pass under the ice because the holes were too small and because the ice around them was unbroken. The woods surrounding the lake were searched thoroughly. No tracks led away from the lake into the forest. No evidence suggested the boys had left the ice and wandered into the surrounding terrain. The snow on the ground around the lake would have shown footprints clearly if the boys had walked through it, but the snow was undisturbed except where the searchers themselves were now walking. Several men went onto the ice with saws and began cutting additional holes, thinking perhaps the boys had somehow gone under the ice through some mechanism that was not immediately apparent. They cut holes systematically across the lake's surface, creating openings through which they could look into the water below, searching for bodies or for any evidence of the boys. They found nothing. The water beneath the ice was clear and shallow enough to see to the bottom in most places, and it contained no bodies, no clothing, no equipment beyond what the boys had deliberately brought and had left on the surface. The search expanded to include the possibility that the boys had somehow left the lake without leaving tracks, perhaps walking on rocks or logs or frozen ground that would not show footprints, perhaps taking a route that the searchers had not yet discovered. Every possible path away from the lake was explored. Every nearby homestead was checked to see if the boys had sought shelter there. Every location where children might conceivably go was examined. No trace of the boys was found. Days passed. The search continued with decreasing intensity as the most likely locations were exhausted, and as the probability grew that the boys had met with some fate that was not immediately discoverable. Theories were proposed that the boys had fallen through ice that had somehow closed over them afterward, that they had wandered away from the lake and had become lost in terrain that seemed too simple to allow true disorientation, that some person or animal had taken them. But each theory failed when, examined against the physical evidence, the ice had not broken. No tracks led away. No evidence supported any scenario that would explain 3 simultaneous disappearances from the center of a small frozen lake. Margaret Turner's understanding of what had happened to her sons developed slowly and painfully over the weeks following their disappearance. Initially, she maintained hope that the boys would be found alive, that some explanation would emerge that would make sense of their absence, that the search would discover them sheltering somewhere or lost somewhere, and that they would be returned to her frightened but unharmed. But as the search extended through January and into February without finding any trace, as the physical evidence remained stubbornly unchanged, equipment on the ice, no broken ice, no tracks away, Margaret had to accept that her sons were gone in a way that defied explanation, that they had vanished so completely that even their bodies had disappeared, and that she would likely never know what had happened to them, or where they had gone, or whether their final moments had been frightening, or painful, or mercifully quick. The grief of losing children was compounded by the mystery of their disappearance, by the absence of any narrative that would allow closure or understanding. If the boys had drowned, their bodies would have been found when the ice melted. If they had frozen on the ice, their bodies would have been visible where they fell. If they had wandered away, their tracks would have shown which direction they had gone. But none of these normal mechanisms of death and discovery had occurred. The boys had simply ceased to exist in a location where ceasing to exist should have been impossible, where the constrained geography and the simple physics of ice and water should have ensured that whatever happened would leave evidence that searchers could find. Margaret asked the questions that had no answers. Where had her sons gone? What had happened in the moments between when Samuel had seen them on the ice setting up their fishing equipment and when Samuel had found that equipment abandoned? Had they suffered? Had they been afraid? Were they somewhere that she could not reach, but where they still existed in some form? Or were they simply gone in a way that was final and absolute? The mystery denied her even the minimal comfort that understanding might provide, left her with only absence and with questions that seemed to have no possible answers. When the spring thaw came in March, the lake ice began to melt. Searchers returned, hoping that the melting ice would reveal what the frozen surface had concealed, that bodies would surface or would be discovered along the lake bed once the ice was gone completely. But the thaw revealed nothing. The lake returned to its normal state, water clear and unremarkable, bottom visible and empty, shores unchanged except by the passage of winter into spring. The Turner boys were not there. Their fishing equipment had been removed during the winter searches, but no other trace of their presence remained. The lake gave up nothing. The absence of bodies created speculation that persisted for years. Some suggested the boys had never actually died on the lake, that they had somehow left its surface without being seen, and had met their fate elsewhere. Lost in the woods, taken by someone with ill intent, victims of some accident that had occurred in a location where their remains might never be discovered. But this explanation required accepting that 3 boys had left a frozen lake without leaving tracks, had avoided being seen by anyone during their departure or their subsequent wandering, and had all met the same fate in the same time period. A series of coincidences that seemed less plausible than the simple fact that they had been on the ice one moment and gone the next. Others suggested supernatural explanations, that the lake had taken the boys, that the ice had somehow consumed them, that they had passed into some other place or state that the physical world could not access or comprehend. These explanations were generally dismissed as superstition, but they persisted because they seemed to account for aspects of the disappearance that natural explanations could not address. The completeness of the vanishing, the absence of any physical trace, the failure of the spring thaw to reveal what winter ice had supposedly concealed. The most unsettling explanation was that there was no explanation, that the boys had vanished through some mechanism or circumstance that was beyond human understanding or documentation, and that their disappearance would remain forever mysterious, not because evidence had been destroyed or concealed, but because the evidence that existed, fishing equipment in place, unbroken ice, no tracks away, described an impossibility that had somehow occurred anyway. The Turner family never recovered from the loss. Samuel and Margaret remained on their homestead for several more years, but the lake 1/2 mile from their cabin became a place they could not bear to see, a constant reminder of sons who had walked onto its ice on a January afternoon and who had never returned. They eventually relocated to a different area, abandoning the property and the proximity to the lake where their children had disappeared. The lake itself became a location that local people avoided, not because it was believed to be actively dangerous, but because it was associated with tragedy that had no resolution, with mystery that had no answer, with the knowledge that 3 children had vanished from its surface, and that their vanishing had left no trace and no explanation. Over the years, occasional reports emerged of people who felt uneasy near the lake, who sensed that something about it was wrong in ways that could not be articulated. But these reports were sporadic and were typically attributed to suggestion and to the power of the story to create anxiety in people who knew what had happened there. The Turner boys' disappearance was never solved. No bodies were ever found. No evidence ever emerged that explained where they had gone or how they had vanished from a frozen lake that was too small to lose anyone and too solid to have allowed them to fall through. The fishing equipment they left behind was kept by the family for years as the only physical connection to the sons who had disappeared, but eventually even these objects were lost to time, leaving only the story and the mystery and the unanswerable question of how 3 boys could walk onto a frozen lake on a clear afternoon and simply cease to exist, while the ice beneath them remained unbroken, and while the world around them showed no evidence of where they had gone. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozarks' most complete disappearances. 3 boys who vanished from a frozen lake in broad daylight, who left behind their equipment and their footprints but no bodies and no explanation, and who demonstrated that sometimes people can disappear so thoroughly that even the spring thaw reveals nothing, that even systematic search finds no trace, and that even a century of speculation produces no answer that satisfies the simple question of where they went when they walked onto ice and never walked off. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where children vanish and frozen lakes keep their secrets, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between disappearance that can be explained and mystery that resists all explanation. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what might have happened to the Turner boys. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozarks, there is a small lake where 3 boys once walked onto the ice to fish on a January afternoon, and where those boys vanished so completely that even when the ice melted, no trace of them remained, leaving only the equipment they left behind and the question of where 3 children could go when surrounded by ice that never broke and water that never gave up what it had taken.